29th, 2000 in Boston, Massachusetts. The session is about to begin.
I've been asked to introduce Trina Crochet. She's an assistant professor at Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston and the owner of Creative Resources. She's the author of The Designer's Guide to Furniture Styles and has written for Design Times magazine. Professor Crochet is a frequent speaker at national and international industry conventions and is an active allied member of the American Society of Interior Designers. Her expertise is in historic preservation, architectural history, and the history of furniture. Trina?
Good morning. How are you this morning? I'd like to talk to you today about American architecture. It happens to be one of my favorite subjects. I actually studied European architecture and was very familiar with Greek, Roman, Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo styles, and was really not that familiar with American architecture, save for the 20th century. About 5 years ago, I moved to Boston to start researching for the book, and decided that this is a really beautiful place, both poetically, culturally, and architecturally. And I started to really explore the areas of New England and gain an appreciation for definitely American architecture, starting back with the colonial times. I thought that it would be a good idea to run the sequence of slides chronologically and then also, wherever possible, pull in some interior views so that we can talk about what's happening with the architectural style in conjunction with the interior design and also the furniture design. When I started to research for the book Designer's Guide to Furniture Styles, my background being in architectural history and art history with interior design, I wanted to pursue the contextualism between furniture, interior design, and architecture. And I know that when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Texas and also graduate student and took art history courses and architectural history courses, furniture history courses, there was really not a lot of emphasis placed on contextualism. So when I approached Prentice Hall about the idea for a book, they thought that it was a great idea. I was very happy with the focus of the book and the excitement from my editors, and very pleased with the results. So what I'm sharing with you are some examples that are actually found in the book. So I will make some references to the European influences, primarily English references, which obviously we have very strong connections to the English influence, specifically in the design of furniture, and I'll explain that as we go along in the slides. And then also just studying the history of the American country and how people had to survive obviously hardships in establishing this country, and then looking at what point in time do they break from the European tradition and develop something that we proudly call an American tradition. So again, as we go through some of the slides, I'll be pointing out various things that may be borrowed from our European counterparts, and then also certain things that deal with the furniture styles and how the American colonists were able to adapt them to their own vernacular. So what I'm starting with is the colonial period, and I have given approximated dates of basically starting in 1670. Now obviously we know that the colonists came over much earlier than 1670. For those of you who live in the neighborhood or the area, you might have gone to Plymouth Plantation a few times and basically walked through the compound of the reproduction of the village at Plymouth. Well, in the beginning, obviously, the colonists were more concerned with survival, and as we know, historically, a lot of the early colonists did not even survive the first winter. But their main focus was trying to use the regional resources to build shelter, and obviously also in this part of the country very concerned with economy, not just because of lack of funds, but economy and design because of the cold weather. So I am going to focus on New England regional styles. I do have a few southern interiors to show you, and again for comparative purposes. But if we take a look at the development of colonial architecture, we have to understand that, again, this is a new colony struggling somewhat financially and struggling basically just to survive. The house on the left that I'm showing you is actually from 1687. Now, it has been added on to, where we have a couple of additions that have been added onto the house. But in the view here, you can pretty much see what was somewhat original for the time period. A couple of characteristics that I'll be pointing out just so that you can get a handle on what is colonial versus Georgian versus federal is if we take a look at this house from the front facade, a couple of characteristics are going to hold true for colonial style. And that is, in this case, we have small windows, we have basically small structures, small rooms, and the introduction of the dormer window on the top. Now, of course, that's not an American development, but it is something that was incorporated into the early colonial style houses because generally the second floor started out as a sleeping loft and then developed into an actual room. Now, what you might notice about this house is that it is somewhat asymmetrical. If you look at the facade and you look at the placement of the dormer windows and the placement of the chimney, you're going to see that it's really not quite balanced. And the reason for that is that in this country, many people who had the means would build a house literally one section at a time, depending on how much money they had and how much they could afford. So it was not uncommon for a young man to start out building a house with one room and perhaps a sleeping loft, and then as he married and the need for additional space ensued, also additional space for children, then the house would be added on to. So what we're looking at here as far as this particular house in 1687 is that, you know, basically, again, we're looking at a style that developed out of a sense of economy and function, and then as we start to catch up in the American colonies with our, let's say, our import-export, raising the consciousness of European culture and developing our own sense of culture, then we're going to also start to see that the scope and size of these homes are going to reflect the wealth. The table settle. And luckily for some people, they could actually afford to have furniture. Most of it, again, was made by local craftsmen. We realized that the colonies were not just settled by the English, but also the Dutch, as well as other places in Europe. But if we look at the table settle to the right, we're looking at, again, economy in design and something that is going to be functional. A lot of colonial furniture and what we classify as early colonial is going to be multifunctional. The reason that it's going to be multifunctional is, again, it's a great expense. Even though it would be made by a local craftsman, still a luxury to own furniture. This is another economic factor that we're going to look at throughout the development of American architecture. The table settle, obviously, is very simple in scope and design. It is something that is indicative of colonial furniture design. However, the form for the table settle dates back to late medieval and early Renaissance times. So once again, it's not particularly a style that was just developed in the American colonies, but it is something that you would have found in a lot of the rural farmhouses of European countries. Now, what I have done on the handout is I've given you the times for the architectural style and then the furniture style, and you'll notice that the dates don't always correspond. One of the most difficult times that I had as a researcher was consulting numerous sources, visiting numerous museums, talking to the curators about their collection, and realizing that pretty much there is a fluctuation of dates. So we do have to take that with a grain of salt and realize that we're just approximating. The other thing I like to point out is in the 19th century they have put labels on these styles. So at the moment in time they wouldn't have considered this to be colonial architecture. It's just that as more research and writing was done on the history of American architecture, people started to address it as far as labeling and categorizing. So unfortunately that's something that we kind of buy into. I typically like to avoid labels and really just try to understand the context of the structure and what was going on politically, socially, and economically for that time period. You're going to see that colonial, something that continues into the 19th century and early 20th century with the colonial revival, and I'll have some examples to show you for that as well. The next structure is from 1699. The structure on the left is the John Beale House, and it also would be indicative of colonial architecture. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice, obviously, is that it's much larger. I'm only moving up 10 years from the previous house. This is also something to take into consideration, and why I think that labeling categories and having to assign dates to them is a little bit misleading, because at this point in time, we're dealing with definitely the difference in social classes. The previous house that I showed you obviously would be built by someone who had fewer financial resources than the John Beale family who built this house also in Hingham. If we take a look at it as far as, again, what makes it colonial, what we will see is when we get to the point where they're building the whole house, they're planning it from the ground up, they realize the size of it is going to not just start with one room and then be added on, but we are dealing with a complete design, that the chimney stays pretty much in the middle. All right? Couple of reasons why it stays in the middle for New England regional styles is because we have better use of it. It's in the center of the room, center of the house, and we're getting more heat distribution. Typically in New England you're going to see small window openings, small rooms, low ceilings, and the centralized chimney or fireplace. In the southern climates we are going to see the fireplace actually shifted to one of the exterior walls, so it's actually on one wall. And obviously that's a practical purpose. We need and depend on our fireplaces a lot more here than we would in South Carolina. The other thing to point out is that with our colonial architecture, the windows in the early times would have been casement. Now, since these houses are still lived in, they're still very much alive, obviously there have been some alterations. The previous house I showed you had 6/6 panel windows, and this one also has the double hung windows. But in the colonial time period, it would have been casement windows, and the design of the casement window is one that actually opens out rather than slides up and down, is that starting with, again, European design and architecture, a lot of people had shutters that would basically close off the opening for the window. Windows were simply something that provided a means for smoke from the fire to get out of the structure. We actually didn't even have chimneys in the Middle Ages until much, much later. 14th century, we're starting to actually see chimneys and fireplaces. Before that time, we were looking at just building a fire in the middle of the floor and opening a window so that the smoke would escape. Obviously, also, we need the windows for ventilation, but to close it off, basically wooden shutters. Now, how we will see this be translated or translated into the southern climates, even in Europe, if we think of the Mediterranean style or Mediterranean countries, you're looking at the louvered shutters so that we can keep them closed, adjust the louvers, keep the sun from coming into the spaces and making those incredibly hot in the summertime, and then also allowing for cross ventilation. So the casement window was a natural transition from the shutter to a glazed panel. And Also considering the early settlers of this country, not a lot of the houses would have had glass. They would have had just wood shutters that would close it off. So we're looking at materials and the resources, and again, what is affordable, which pretty much creates a category for a style. If we take a look at the room setting on the right, we're looking at basics, basic, functional, very simplistic furniture. Items, again, that would be made from local woods by local craftsmen, and most of the work that we see in the early colonial period will be turned items, where they will turn spindles or turn chair legs on a lathe, because it was a very quick way and economical way of producing a piece of furniture without the detailing of hand carving. And just to point out a few items that are in the room, we have a rope bed. The rope bed literally supports the mattress using ropes, and there would be a key that you would use to tighten the ropes to adjust, whether you want a sagging bed or a little more firmness on the bed. And then plus also the strength of the ropes would wear over time, and you'd have to retighten the ropes. The chair to the right, again, very simple. Something that we call a carver chair, simple wooden chair, not a lot of embellishments. And then the piece to the right of the chair is a blanket chest. A blanket chest is something that is typically more American than European. We had chests and trunks in Europe. Actually, they date all the way back into Egyptian times, but the alteration that the Americans made to the chest or the trunk is basically they made it taller, and they divided it into two sections. It's actually one piece of furniture, but the top section, the top of the piece opens, it's hinged, so that you can use it as a trunk. And then generally there's a drawer beneath it. And this one other thing to just point out is you can notice the scale of this room is quite small. The furniture for the American colonial period and continuing into the Georgian period is going to be small scale, and that is again to accommodate the smaller interiors that we have. One of the other things that I noticed in researching is that even though you're looking at something in a book or you're looking at something that might be a house museum, there are a few things that aren't completely correct. I think historic preservation has come a long way as far as, we're no longer having to depend on associations, ladies associations in the past who were jumping in and trying to save old buildings and then just doing the best that they could at restoring them based on the limited funds they had, to actually trying to recreate exactly what would have been typical of the period. The one fallacy that I want to point out with this slide of the room setting is the rug that's on the floor. For this time period, that type of a rug would have been an extreme luxury. It's very rare that we would even see it in a house of this time period. And even if we did see something that was a beautiful rug such as this, they would never put it on the floor at this time. It was too precious. It would have gone over a table. So it wouldn't have been something that they walked on. And keep this in mind, because I am going to show you a Georgian house that was owned by a ship merchant, and you'll see that even in their house they didn't even have these beautiful oriental rugs. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of interiors. I brought one in on the left from England. Now, let me just tell you, the date on the one on the right is 1763. If we were just looking at dates, 1763 would put us into what we would call the Georgian period in America. There are still many, many colonial characteristics in the room setting on the right. One of those being, again, multifunctional furniture. If you take a look at the central table, it's a gate leg. A gate leg table is something that will expand. You swing out the gates and you have a larger surface area, and then you can also swing the gates in, drop the leaves, and you have a much smaller table that can be moved out of the center of the room as needed for other activities. In colonial days, obviously, again, houses were smaller, and so rooms were somewhat multifunctional as well. You generally might start out with a main room, and it would not be uncommon to have a bed in that main room as well. If we look at some of the furniture, the chairs, for example, again, we're sticking with turned pieces, simple baluster turning on the legs. We have basic stretchers used to help support the chairs. And then if you notice the chair that's on the back wall against the wood paneling, we see the use of cane. Cane is something that is, again, very economical material. It's not something that is just typical with American design. It is something that resulted after the Great Fire in London, and the cabinet makers in London were scrambling to replace furniture, and so there's where you see a lot of cane introduced, and it becomes a stylistic development. If we were comparing the styles of American colonialism and comparing those to what was going on in England, we would want to refer to the English Jacobean style and the William and Mary style. The interior on the left is actually dated from 1600 in England, and I thought that this was a great contrast to show that, you know, again, it's not so much that we're directly borrowing from the English, but we are bringing a little bit of that heritage with us as we settle and develop in the colonies. We notice that in the English interior, the ceilings are much higher, the rooms are more grand. Obviously, this would have been a home owned by someone of incredible wealth. We see the wood paneling on the walls, the very large fireplace, and if you do notice the wood chairs lining against the wall, they're very similar to the ones that appear in the American interior. We take a look at the American interior and we see the wood floors that again mimic the designs and use of material that we would see in England. We do see the fireplace, however, it's very small, and it's surrounded by Delft tiles, which is something that would have been commonly imported and brought into the American colonies around the 1760s. We also look and notice that the ceilings are much lower, and you know, with that, just the proportion and scale of the room is also smaller. Now, it may surprise you that if I tell you that the house on the right, or the interior on the right, would have been owned by someone of great wealth. So we are comparing basically wealth to wealth. And the one thing that I want to also stress is that we are dealing with something that is over 150 years apart. In England, in the 1600s, 17th century, we would be looking at the Renaissance and works of some of the architects that are bringing in very classical elements and details. And in America, we will have very reserved modifications of that style. There really isn't anything that we would identify as an American Renaissance, but you know, again, America is going to get into its own glory in the federal period. Okay, let's look at some Georgian. If we take a look at the time period for Georgian architecture, we're roughly looking at 1735 to 1790. And then again, realizing that these styles definitely overlap. It's not like today where we're such a disposable society that every 20 years we might want to throw things out and get things that are new. We typically will see, again, kind of an evolution and a transition from one style to the next. What I want to point out with characteristic Georgian architecture is a couple of developments. The first thing is that the fireplaces, moving from the central chimney, what we would see in Colonial, is now placed on the two exterior walls. We've shifted those, we've moved them out, and this is something that is going to stay pretty standard even through the American federal period that follows. If you take a look at the house on the left, it's actually the Derby House in Salem. This was a house that was owned by our terms, someone that would have been a multimillionaire, shipping magnate. And we look at the house and we go to the house and we, you know, realize that for that time period it would have been very luxurious. The slide on the right is actually showing you the parlor of the Derby House. Characteristically, if we look at the exterior of this Georgian style house, we're noticing symmetry. Symmetry is starting to be more developed again in late Colonial when they're looking at the structure as a whole unit and not basically compartmentalizing the project into one room and then we're going to add on to it and then add on to it as we have the resources. The other thing that you'll notice about the Georgian architectural style is that we do have the dormers, but there's more articulation to the dormers. The designers, architects are using some of these classically based influences that are indicative of, again, European design, obviously borrowed from Greek and Roman. And if you take a look, the tops have pediments. We have segmented pediments and triangular pediments. In the Georgian style, we're going to start to see more exploration of classical elements on the exteriors of structures. And then late Georgian, we're going to start to see how these are introduced into the interiors. The other thing, just to point out, the windows at this time would have been the either 12 over 12, 8 over 8, 6 over 6, double hung windows. It is something that in this country is a development of the Georgian style, and primarily through more abundance of glass and the resources for actually, again, producing or manufacturing the glass. If you take a look at the entry, the basic house is simplistic on the outside. There's a little bit of embellishment. Then what we're going to start to notice in, again, Georgian, that's going to take us into federal style, is the fact that the entrance is going to be emphasized. In this case, we see a triangular pediment over the door. We do not have at this point yet a projecting portico or porch, but we are starting to see some articulation and emphasis placed on the entry. This is something that, again, is going to be a very strong characteristic of federal style. If we take a look at the interiors, once again, even though this was a home for a millionaire for the time period, we have small rooms. This would have been the gentleman's parlor, and set up quite appropriately as far as the furnishings that are typical of the 1760s. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out about this is, notice on the floor we do have a floor cloth. In the Derby House, it was determined that a lot of the floor coverings were actually floor cloths, which would be painted cloth with a type of protection varnish over it, so that it's almost, a lot of people say, oh, it's early linoleum. But it was something that was very practical, very economical, and what we would consider, again, as something that is a little more indicative of the American ingenuity. This is clearly an example of why that previous room setting that I showed you was not really historically interpreted correctly. Okay, and you know, don't ever go to a movie with me, especially a period movie, because I can pick them out like nothing. All right. The other thing I just wanted to point out is the interior detailing. We're seeing wainscoting. We're seeing that the rough-hewn beams that would have been exposed in colonial architecture is now encased, painted. Typical with Georgian interiors, we do see the introduction of pigments, paints on the millwork, on the woodwork. This is something that will change in the federal style, which I think, you know, if I had to put a favorite on any of my periods of American architecture, it would definitely be the federal style, and I'll explain why when I show you some of the slides. But we will see, again, that the rooms still remain somewhat small, even though this is someone of great financial resources. It won't be until the federal period until we start to see a little more grandiose structures. And then again, just for basis of comparison, and again, why it's very difficult to say that certain date one style stopped and then we're starting to see the influence of the next style. I brought in two room settings. The first one on the left, it would be typical of our Georgian interior. We have the wood floors, we have the very simple turned furniture, we have the wainscoting on the wall, we have the application of the pigmented paint on the trim, the doors, the wainscoting. And then if we take a look at the room on the right, from the same time period, we're starting to see much more elaborate interior, and we're starting to see that even though we are dealing with families of wealth, that there's still variations of wealth and what actually that money can buy. If we take a look at the one on the right, you'll probably start to notice that there's a lot more articulation to the interior architecture. We're starting to see plaster ceilings. We're starting to see plaster mantels, fireplaces. We're starting to see, again, a little more attention paid to these, what we would call classical elements, such as swags and pediments, and just basically the influence of Greek and Roman. 1760 is a time when Pompeii was rediscovered, and in Europe we see the beginnings, end of kind of the Rococo period and beginnings of what we call the early neoclassic period. So there's going to be an emphasis more on not so much imitating what artifacts are being removed from Pompeii, but just this whole fascination with Roman design and Roman styles, and we'll also be seeing that in the furniture as well. The furniture on the right is much finer than the furniture that's shown on the left. The left style would still be indicative of colonial furniture, where if we take a look at the furniture on the right, we refer that in American terms as the late colonial. And again, if we're trying to equate this with what would be popular in England for the late colonial style of American architecture, these are local craftsmen, again, cabinet makers, who are duplicating from pattern books the styles that would be prevalent in England. So we are going to see a lot of Queen Anne influences, and more specifically for this time period, the Chippendale, because we credit Thomas Chippendale with basically his director that had engraved drawings of furniture with proportions and measurements and details. And once that pattern book was published, it infiltrated the American colonies, and this is where we see a very huge step up as far as, not so much wealth, because again we're looking at fairly equal wealth, but as far as high style. And we will see that once we do get into this late colonial style of furniture and design, that it becomes very opulent. It becomes very delicately carved, as you can see on these Chippendale chairs. And then as a result of that detailing, we're also seeing again the more embellishment in the architecture. Furniture, we're carving it, and in the architecture we're using a lot of plasterwork moldings. Okay, I always like to bring in people. Again, I don't like to look at things in a vacuum. So it was fascinating for me to, in conjunction... There it goes again. I didn't even touch it that time. Maybe I'll just hold it. How's that? Can you still hear me? Okay, we'll just deal with this. Okay. All right, so anyway, going back to taking a look at the people, unfortunately, when I was putting together the book, there were so many things that I wanted to include as far as architectural structures, interiors, and examples of furniture, that I know now that in the revision I will put more photographs in it showing exactly what these people looked like that lived in these interiors. If we take a look at the slide on the left, this is a family portrait coming from the 1780s. And what I find so sweet about this is just basically the vernacular of American folk art, and how we're looking at, a little bit off on the perspectives and the kind of the innocence, what I call the innocence of the American painter at this time. Obviously, by comparison, we know that European painters would have impeccable skills at recreating what an interior would look like, or what these individuals would look like. But what I feel is priceless about these portraits is that it really does show the family in the interior element. It shows them sitting on the furniture. It shows them using the tables, something that we're never allowed to see when we go into house museums or we look at rooms that are recreated for us in museums. And this is something that, again, I think appeals to me, not just because of the design and then again how these were used on a day-to-day basis, but it piqued my interest a little more in studying the history of costume. And then I really started to see the connection between the design of ladies' dresses and why certain chairs had to be designed specifically to accommodate the way ladies dressed. And an example of that is when we are into this late 18th century period, there were costumes that women would wear that wouldn't even allow them to really sit on furniture. They actually had to perch. So I'm sure they had very strong leg muscles, but they had to perch because they couldn't really sit. And this is something, again, that I find very interesting and fascinating. It's, once again, going back to this sense of contextualism and how we can't just look at things in a vacuum, but we have to see what were the influencing factors that caused these designers to come up with new and different things. And, you know, just like today, ladies' fashion just has to change so often that it's why, again, we're seeing a lot of development of different types of chairs. If we take a look at the slide on the right, then again, we're still seeing kind of this kind of carryover from what would be very simple interiors with limited articulation with the moldings, the mantels, and even in this case, the arched windows in this particular parlor. But we are also seeing with this that, you know, even though I'm in the late 18th century, it's still not uncommon to have that common room where it might be your sleeping room, but it's also the same room where you take your breakfast or perhaps take your lunch. Also noticing again that the room sizes tend to be small, lower ceilings, and just very small quarters. If we take a look at the tall boy that's on the left, the chest on chest, they tend to look very large and somewhat oversized for the interiors. But again, these are following a little more in proportion to what would have been generated in England for the same time period. And then once again, the interior setting as far as the furniture, this would be late colonial American furniture, but definitely something that was influenced by Queen Anne and Chippendale styling. Okay, you're not going to get out of here today without hearing about Charles Bulfinch. All right, we're in Boston, and it's a name that is highly respected in this area. This is actually a house that's two houses down from where I lived in Hingham. And the rumor is, now the Historical Society has tried to actually document this, but it is rumored that this house is a Charles Bulfinch house. Basically, it was a 3-story dwelling where they removed the top 2 floors, and legend has it that they shipped it down to Hingham on a barge. All right, now we would like to say that that is 100% true. There are things that lead us to believe that part of it is true. How much of it is true, we don't know, but we feel very confident that it is one of Charles Bulfinch's very early designs. We're not crediting Charles Bulfinch with the development of the American Federal style. We're simply crediting Charles Bulfinch with this sense of, again, assimilating a style that would have been popular in England. We're obviously dealing with the neoclassical period and the designs of Robert Adam and some of his counterparts. If we are looking at neoclassical again, we're emphasizing a little more Roman type details, things that again have been influenced by the excavations at Pompeii. What I want to point out with a couple of the significant changes, if you recall on the Derby House, we had a very pronounced roof. Even in the colonial housing style, we have a very steeply pitched roof. We continue that in the Georgian period. In the Federal period, we're starting to use more of a low hip roof, and then by the later American Federal period, we're actually going to see no roof at all but flat roofs with a balustrade going across the top. The other thing that we're starting to see appear is the articulation of the corners. We're starting to see more decorative embellishments on the facades of these houses, and it's not uncommon to see windows that would be flanked by pilasters, classical pilasters. The piece on the right I brought in to just kind of remind us where we are in American history. What we're looking at is a slant front secretary, and again it's a style that would have been somewhat imitated from French and also English styles. But what I think is very curious about this piece is that, again, it hints at what is going on politically within the American colonies. And what we will start to see with American Federal furniture is the introduction of the eagle as a strong design characteristic. And this is relating back to the establishment of the First Continental Congress and the adoption of the eagle as the mascot. Okay, if we look at some more federal and looking at what, again, the previous slide would have been a three-story structure, I decided to bring in something that would be a little more modest. The slide on the left, if you look through the balustrade that's on the top of the roof, or the top of the cornice, you can actually see the low hip roof through that. So we're starting to emphasize more of the facade and horizontalness rather than verticality. The chimneys, as you notice, are still on the flanking walls, the exterior walls of the structure. This is something that, again, is characteristic of Georgian and continues into the American Federal style. And what I like about the Federal style is that, again, I feel that it is a very mature style for American architecture. What we're doing, again, is we're not imitating what's going on in England. We're not copying it, but we have some very gifted designers and architects, such as Bulfinch and Samuel McIntyre, who are interpreting these structures in a uniquely American way. If we take a look at the entry, one of the things that we start to see in the mature Federal style is the development of some sort of a portico over that front entryway, so that once again it's more emphasized and there's more of a focal point placed on the entry. And also you may notice that directly above the entry is our beautiful Palladian window. This is something that we will see quite a bit of in our Federal style architecture. We have beautiful Palladian window with side lights, and then that also becomes duplicated over the actual door entry area. Another kind of special development that occurred in interior design in the Federal period is the development of a dining room, a specific room that is not multifunctional, a specific room that is set up for the purposes of dining. And through that, we're going to start to see the introduction of new types of furniture. And once again, the furniture is something that I stress definitely comes out of its architectural context. If we're going to have a room now for dining, we're going to create specific pieces of furniture that are going to enable us to enjoy that experience. The American Federal style of furniture is something, again, that's adapted from an English style to designers working in England at this time, George Hepplewhite and Thomas Sheraton. So if I were to have to say, one way or the other about the chairs in this dining room, we would typically look at them and say, oh, they're Sheraton-style chairs. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that they're not Sheraton. They're American Federal. And there's a lot of sweetness about these chairs that make them truly American. For one thing, the scale is much more delicate than what we would see in England. The other thing I want to point out is the little sideboard that we have and the articulation to the front, something that we call a serpentine front. Some of these pieces will have what we call a bow front. But we actually are starting to see the pieces of furniture that are also starting to have projections on the facade in a similar manner that the architecture of the American Federal houses was starting to have these projections on the facades with the porticos. And then with Samuel McIntyre working in Salem, mostly Salem, or the North Shore, the slide on the left is of the Gardner Pingree House, dating from 1804. Our dates for the Federal period, roughly 1785 to 1820. And once again, there is a lot of overlap between what we see as Federal and then what will become Greek Revival. In the Federal style, we're definitely dealing with proportions, very fine sense of proportions. And then once again, the articulation of the facades are emphasizing classical elements. In this case, you can take a look at the windows, and we do have pediments over the windows. And if we look at the front entryway, here we have a portico, again, in a bow shape, or the semicircular shape. This is basically what I was referring to earlier as far as how then furniture is going to start to take on some of the characteristics of architecture. And again, it's not that it's the first time that that happens. A lot of furniture throughout the development of history of furniture design is borrowing certain elements from architecture in its design. The room on the right is not from the Gardner Pingree house, but it is actually a room that was designed by Samuel McIntyre. We look at him as an architect. We also respect him as a great wood carver, and we can attribute actually certain pieces of furniture that are coming from his workshop. The bedroom I thought was very nice to show you as far as, you know, here we have a very private space. It's American Federal. We're still dealing with a little more wealth as far as the American economic situation. But again, by comparison to what would be going on in England, the rooms are still small. They're still very modest. We can safely say that we're not really going to see the grandiose spaces until we get into the 19th century, the late 19th century, when we're starting to see the great industrialists building these enormous mansions so that they can show off how much money they have. And I'm going to show you a few of those as well. But what I did want to point out about this is that, again, the connection between interior design and architecture. If I'm talking about the neoclassical movement in architecture in England, and specifically the work of Robert Adam, we know that he features a lot of classical details, especially things like garlands and swags and pateras and pediments and urns. And if we take a look at this bedroom, I think it's very eloquently executed in how this influence is translated from architecture, an architectural element, into something that is used as a drapery for the bedding or a drapery for the windows. Or if we take a look at these very sweet American Federal chairs that would be shield back chairs, we're looking at the very delicate carved splats that also are imitating the urns and the swags. Now, once again, the shield back chair is something that would have been somewhat associated with the designs of Hepplewhite. There are basic chair back designs that kind of place them either coming from one workshop or the other, but there was really a lot of exchange between Hepplewhite and Sheraton. And even when you look through their pattern books, you'll see some similar designs in both. It's something that we've kind of adopted as saying, oh, this is Hepplewhite because it's curved backs, and this is Sheraton because it's a more squared back. But again, there's a lot of exchange between the two. And if we take a look at the seats, it may seem minor, but it's something, again, that is so subtle, but we're realizing the integration, again, of all of the arts. And we look at the fronts of these little chairs, and we see the serpentine shape. So that even though I have a serpentine sideboard maybe in the dining room, then I'm seeing this serpentine shape repeated in various other elements. And again, it's something that's very subliminal, but yet it reads, again, as a total design. I thought that it would be nice to just show you a couple of close-ups of furniture. And if we take a look at the American Federal chair on the right, you can see how delicate the swags are carved in that splat back. And what I particularly like about this piece is how beautiful the nail heads that are used to attach the upholstery are imitating, again, this sense of the swag that would have been, again, very typical for English neoclassic design. And in France, it would be equivalent to the Louis XVI style, also a classical period. The little writing desk on the left, what we're seeing doesn't come out too clear in the slide, but we're looking at a lot of marquetry patterns, inlaid wood patterns that are, again, imitating certain features coming from the architecture. And what this little secretary has on the left are these little fan motifs that are actually inlaid wood that would be similar to the fan lights that would be placed over the doorway of our American Federal home. And here we have on the left, this is actually a detail so that you are able to see the fan light. Again, typical characteristic of American Federal architecture. Side lights are the glazed panels flanking each side of the door. Now, if I show you this slide, I know you've seen it before. We all recognize it. Okay, but we're seeing it with alterations. When we look at the structure, the original structure, there was actually a competition that was held to see what kinds of designs would come in for the White House. And there was a gentleman from South Carolina that actually won the commission to design the White House. And what we will have to do is strip off the portico and take a look at the structure for what it really started out as, and that was a federal house. If we take a look at the flat roof, we take a look at the balustrade across the top, we take a look at the lower windows with the pediments over each window, and we take a real close look at the doorway. We're going to see the fan light over the door, and we're going to see the side lights. I think the White House is a great example of how we will take something that might have been a style going out of fashion and turning it into a style that is now prevalent fashion. If we consider the time period again, and we're looking at a newly formed United States of America, and we recognize the significant contributions made by Thomas Jefferson in trying to set up a national style of architecture and design for America, what we really did is we reinvented a Greek and Roman style. It basically became our American national style just because of the government buildings constructed in Washington, D.C. took on the influences of this, the Roman and Greek influences. Because of the public buildings taking on a reflection of the Greek style and Roman style, we're also then going to see that the residences follow suit. This would be the same period of time when we're recognizing Duncan Phyfe, American cabinet maker and designer of also considered American Federal style furniture, but again it's a very late Federal style. We are, as we're seeing Greek revival kind of creep into the American vernacular, we're starting to see how the interior furnishings are also going to kind of emulate certain artifacts that were either removed from Pompeii or documented in the frescoes that were found in Pompeii. The room setting on the left is a Duncan Phyfe creation, Duncan Phyfe design. And if we take a look at the chairs, you'll notice that the bases of the chairs are a little more classical. They actually remind us of some of the Greek folding stools and Roman folding stools that would have been used and then duplicated and imitated in a new fashion in the Renaissance, and then brought back again in the late neoclassical period. And then again, as we can see with Duncan Phyfe, he's not copying what would have been popular in the English Regency late classical style or the French Empire style, but again considering the scale and the proportions of the American interior and then adjusting and modifying that design accordingly. The slide on the right is also of the same period, and the one thing that I wanted to point out as far as a significant change perhaps in the interior is that when we do start to get into the Greek revival period, this is where we're actually starting to see more scenic papers. And the scenic papers is something, again, that traveling and visiting a lot of historical houses, you might see it in a Federal style house. It was something that was more popular when we start to get into the Greek revival. And it's another thing to point out is that as you're looking at houses or historical houses, house museums, is you have to be sensitive to what is original and then what is actually something that was added later. And I make that case because the Gardner Pingree House in Salem, the third floor area has scenic paper, and that would not have been appropriate for that time period. First of all, because it's Federal and it wasn't as popular for that time period when it was constructed. And the second thing is the third level was primarily servants. You're not going to put a very expensive paper on a third level landing where it's just servants. Usually that paper is going to go in a parlor or go in the entryway. The other thing I just wanted to point out quickly is that we're starting to see in the Greek Revival very rich, deep reds, deep blues, rich mahoganies used for the furniture, rosewoods. And this is something, again, that if we credit what they were taking out of Pompeii, there's a lot of similarity of the colors. The richness of the frescoes are those colors because they used all natural pigments, and those natural pigments were obviously indigenous to the area. So we will see in the American Empire style of interior that follows suit with the Greek Revival style of architecture. We're going to see these rich jewel tones, greens, golds, reds, blues, crimsons. And specifically with American Empire style of furniture, how it differs from American Federal furniture is that it becomes a little more authentic in its duplication of Greek and Roman designs. And just to clarify a point here, even though Pompeii was a Roman city, we do realize that the Romans borrowed significantly from the Greeks. So the architecture, we do label it as Greek Revival. However, the interiors and the furnishings and even the window treatments that we see in these homes are duplicating more typically what would have been used in Roman times. As you, I'm sure, know, Napoleon was a proponent of the French Empire style. Two architects that were working for his court at the time, Percier and Fontaine, did a lot to introduce this late neoclassical style to Europe, and again, those were very closely related to the Greek and Roman architecture of antiquity. Also, just to make a connection here, the reason that we see a lot of it in Washington, D.C. is, again, Thomas Jefferson, remembering history, he spent quite a bit of time in France. And what he brought back, amongst lots of things like wine and furniture, and he brought back this sense that the idea for this new nation would be totally based on democracy, and therefore the Greek style of architecture was very appropriate. And again, keep in mind that this was something that would have been very prevalent also in France during his stay. All right, so we're basically in the 19th century now, and again, dates for Greek Revival I have roughly starting 1820 to about 1860. Again, there's a lot of overlap. The furniture didn't quite last as long. Dates of 1815, which would coincide with the American Federal style of furniture, to about 1840. I think the 19th century is probably the most difficult period to put a label on, which is why I don't like labels, but we have labels. So the reason why is because we see such an eclecticism of styles in the 19th century. We label the period as the Victorian period. Obviously, in England, we're naming it after Queen Victoria, which had a very, very lengthy reign, but there is what we call an American Victorian style as well. What I'm showing you on the left is actually a drawing from a pattern book. The 19th century, I think, instead of calling it Victorian, I think we should really call it the century of revivalist styles, because it is mid-19th century to late 19th century that we are going to see let's say, a interpretation of the past. And that past takes on numerous styles, from the Gothic and medieval period, through the Italian Renaissance period, through the French Second Empire period. And if we take a look at some of the pattern books that were being published, it makes sense why we're starting to see, again, this dominance of the style in American architecture. The little house on the right dates from 1847. and I don't actually have a date of the pattern book on the left, but just holding that date in mind, 1847, what primarily brought about an interest in the Gothic past was the burning of Parliament houses in England and the rebuilding of Parliament in 1835, 1836. To keep the design consistent with the surrounding envelope of that area in London, the design of the Parliament houses were Gothic. And that is how we start to see this interest, reintroduction of these Gothic influences. We're moving away from a horizontal emphasis that would have been typical with Federal, and we're starting to see the return of a vertical emphasis through basically these very steep pitched roofs, and then also this excessive ornamentation, which we typically call in America gingerbreading. Lots of millwork that's following almost every slope, nook, and cranny of these structures. And then again, to prove my point of being a very eclectic period or revivalist period for the 19th century, the house on the left is indicative of the Second Empire style that again is drawing its influence from French Second Empire, thinking of, again, the point in time where in France we're starting to see the reintroduction of a mansard roof, something that would have been indicative of French Renaissance architecture. I think that the house on the left is, again, how the Americans are starting to interpret these styles and yet developing their own unique interpretation of these styles. The house on the right is our version of the Renaissance revival, the Italian Renaissance revival, something that the English would interpret quite differently, but here in America we typically see it as very box form with the tall projecting tower, which might remind us of some of the town halls of 15th century Siena or Florence. We will tend to put a lot of embellishment on the exterior, accentuate the cornices, put some classical details such as the dentil moldings, perhaps pilasters, columns, things like that that might surround windows and doors. And again, as we're developing in what we call the Victorian era, we're starting to see again that the emphasis is on big. The emphasis is on vertical. The emphasis is on opulence. The emphasis is on pretty much covering every available space with some sort of pattern or design or ornament. The structure on the left is actually from 1880, and the interior on the right is roughly 1860, 1870. What we are again noticing is that there is this definite interest in revivalist styles. Not so much the exterior in this case, because I do feel that the structure on the left is once again more of an American interpretation of Victorian design, but the interior on the right is something again that I think reflects American ingenuity. The furniture is actually some of the first, let's say, machine-made furniture. John Henry Belter was a cabinet maker in New York and did a lot of experimenting with laminating wood and then using carving machines or pressing machines to produce furniture that actually looked like it was hand-carved, but it was simply pressed. If you were able to walk around these chairs and see them from the back, they're going to be perfectly flat and smooth. So there's only the articulation on the front, and that's part of the reason was because of the machinery that was used to create these pieces, and then the second reason again is for economy. But if we do take a look at the interiors, we're sticking with the very rich jewel tones, the very rich colors, the blues, the golds. We're looking at lots of pattern. It was not uncommon to use several different patterns in a Victorian interior, whether it's a Gothic revival or even an arts and crafts style. They simply loved putting different patterns together, and for us it might seem excessive and it might seem kind of disjointed, but to them it was indicating again high style. These are two Victorian interiors I thought the one on the left was just absolutely beautiful, but you have to like purple to be able to live in this room. But we're still looking at the influence of John Henry Belcher and this machine-made furniture with the carving that is, again, supposed to imitate the fine carvings of Louis XV style furniture that would be prevalent in France in the 18th century. And also the pieces on the right are actually a Victorian introduction of a federal style. What we might recognize are the little Sheraton chairs, but yet they're not quite Sheraton or what we would call American Federal. It's the Victorian eclecticism again that's being emphasized. And also just one other thing to point out in this room on the right is how articulate the drapery is and how massive it becomes. Because I want to prepare you for this next interior. Okay, we get a little bit excessive, we get a little bit overbearing. We're taking a look at these Victorian houses, and the one on the left, I just say, it's a combination of everything. It's got the Italianate with the big tower. It has the mansard roof of the Second Empire. It has some of the gingerbreading of the Gothic revival. We're seeing again this sense of ornamentation exploding. Something that we didn't really see since the Rococo period in France. We think of Versailles. If we take a look at the interior on the right, this is again where we're epitomizing pattern. Every pattern known to man would have been on the textiles, the carpeting, the wall coverings, the carved details within the room. And just to kind of bring us up to date economically, this is also the time period, late 19th century, when we have a lot of the industrialists who are making exorbitant amounts of money. And what are they doing with that money? They're building homes all over Newport and Hyde Park, and the bigger the better. My house has to be bigger than the house down the street. I have to spend more money on my house than the person down the street. If you've ever gone to the Breakers in Newport, it's a Vanderbilt house. That house was built specifically to be used only a few weeks out of the year. Yet you go in it, it's opulent, it's elaborate, and the dining room chairs weigh about 65 pounds each. That you have to have somebody literally pull your chair out so that you could sit down, and then they'll push you up to the table. But where I want to close with all of this is getting back to the start of my favorite period is into modernism. If we really understand the past, we can then understand modernism, and we can understand what the architects of the 20th century were trying to achieve. We start to see this scaled back Victorianism with the shingle style, something again that is quite prevalent in New England, and the arts and crafts style that would also be distributed throughout the United States. The house on the left would be typical, what we would call shingle style home. And what I brought in was an example of a colonial home that dates from the early 18th century. So that in my sense of the word, we're not really looking backwards, but we're going back to the sense of simplicity, purity of design, and functionalism. And I want to wrap this up. We can't talk about the American tradition in architecture without looking at some works of Frank Lloyd Wright. He had a lot of fallacies. He wasn't the only architect working in this kind of forward direction. We see houses by Green and Green that were also very progressive in their design. What I'm showing you on the left is a house by Frank Lloyd Wright. I think a lot of people are surprised by his early work, because his early work really did capture a lot of the Victorian elements of design that was taking place. The vertical emphasis, the steeply pitched roofs, and to a lot of extent this sense of detailing. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright, what he'll do with the detailing, however, is instead of it being Gothic or Italian Renaissance, he looks to Eastern influences and also natural influences, and so the designs tend to be a little more geometric. He advances, as we know, from the previous house, which was 1895, to the Roby House, which is 1909. The Roby House on the left is actually in Chicago, and it has just finished its restoration. So I haven't been there since they restored the interior, but the last time I was there, it was somewhat sparse, but they did go through extensive renovation, and from what I understand, the interior is now immaculate. But if we look at Frank Lloyd Wright, and we look at his design for the Roby House, we're really truly starting to see once again, American ingenuity, and how we're seeing someone who is interpreting the use of materials, interpreting modernism that would have been prevalent in Europe at the turn of the 20th century, and creating interiors that are, not quite reminiscent of the Victorian period, but we're still going back to things that are natural elements within our interior environments, like the wood wainscoting, the wooden floors. We're looking at the basic fireplace as being the central focus of the house. If you take a look at the Roby House slide, in Frank Lloyd Wright's work, the fireplace was usually centralized. Again, where is it coming from? It's coming from this colonial architecture of the past, but it's fresh, it's new, it's interpretive, and it's also, again, indicative of the economy and the forward thinking of people at the turn of the 20th century. Industry is something that is making people very wealthy, just like, now it's the age of information and the internet. What I find really fascinating about the whole research for the book and making the comparisons that I do at the end of each chapter is that it all comes from something. But what is very creative about it is the artist's interpretation. The chairs on the left are Frank Lloyd Wright chairs. There are dining room chairs that were designed for the Roby House. You notice they have tall backs, very straight spindles, very erect as far as the design of the backs of the chairs. And I had to bring in a Colonial turned chair, the Brewster chair, because in a sense of looking at Frank Lloyd Wright's furniture, and why a lot of people said, oh my gosh, this is so uncomfortable. How can anybody sit in it? How can you expect anybody to sit in it? It was all wood. There wasn't a lot of padding on something like this. Well, we're going right back to American colonialism with the furniture of, again, it's simplistic, it's purified, there's a sense of innocence about it, it's functional. Our little Brewster chair is something that would have had just a pillow for the seat. The back is very erect. It is something, again, that would be made out of, local woods. As we know, Frank Lloyd Wright loved to use quarter-sawn oak for a lot of the furnishings and the millwork that went into his homes. So I try to always create a relationship. The design of the chair on the cover of the book is by Robert A.M. Stern, someone I'm sure you've heard of. He's a world-renowned architect. He has done a lot of building throughout the world. He designed this chair in 1989. The first time I saw it was in Chicago when I went to Neocon, and he was actually speaking, introducing his new textile line, and I fell in love with the chair. And when I saw that chair, I started to go back. I was still in the writing stages of the book and organizing stages of the book, and that's what gave me the idea to put the comparisons at the end of each chapter, so that we can see that with Robert Stern, he's not just imitating or duplicating, but he really is assimilating some of the finer qualities of something that would have been a previous style. The chair on the left is actually an English Regency style, so this would be early 19th century. And prior to it being English Regency, this is something that we would have seen coming right out of the artwork found in Pompeii. It's very Roman in its design. If we look at just the legs of it, the legs are very Greek in design. So I appreciate the fact that even though we have modernism, the house on the right, which I consider a treasure of not American architecture, but modern architecture, the Schroeder House in Utrecht, basic time period 1924. Well, as we know, modern architecture is something that we somewhat see extensively in this country in the 50s, the post-war housing boom. But what I like to come back to is the sense that in American design, especially residential design, we don't quite feel as comfortable in these modern interiors as we do with things that are historic in nature. The house on the left is actually my house in Hingham, and it's a colonial revival built in 1921. So, you know, I think the thing that's most valuable about studying, again, the American tradition in architecture is that we're not really just duplicating, but there's so many other factors and elements that go into the thought process and the creative process of the designers. I thank you very much for your attention. Well, I'd be happy to talk with you. I'll be headed over to the bookstore to sign books if you're interested in that, and I'll be happy to talk to you about anything that we've discussed today. Thanks.
This is the end of this cassette presentation.